Well, I want to thank you ladies for a wonderful and extremely interesting presentation today. Lots to take in there, of course. Um, Working in Veterans Affairs and having been in the military, just some great takeaways just about the really unique nature of service and the bonds that people who serve in the military form with one another, how that can change over time, how that changes the longer away from the release date they are, and how how the impact that has on supports for them, and how that might impact the risk of experiencing homelessness. So very, very interesting. We have a number of questions. I see the first one has come in, and I'm going to throw this out there, and I want to thank the audience for your engagement. Please type in more questions as they come up. We've got three great brains here that we can pick. So the first one I want to ask you is, could you speak more about the challenge of exploring intersections between military service and homelessness, with potentially such a large time difference, as you discussed in your statistical slide. So I don't know which one of you wants to attack this first, but I'll open it up.
So maybe I'll jump in first, and then I think possibly Hannah could maybe speak to part of this in relation to the programming at Old Brewery and the engagement. And I'm sure that Kate Ploser also has something to add to that. So I think that one of the challenges that we faced was in the process of doing the interviews, taking people through time, because people are mostly focused on what most recent events led to their homelessness. And that is a lot of what gets spoken about and a lot of the focus. And so we were very mindful in the way that we constructed the interview, that we wanted to start with that exit out of the military as our kind of first focal point. And then, as we explained in the presentation, we did the interviews in two parts. So we came back to the childhood piece and childhood into the military in the second part, but we wanted to take people back to get that kind of story. And I think for the feedback that we got from the participants was that that was actually a really interesting process for them to think about that trajectory, because they've been so focused on the immediate, what led to the homelessness, and to see that as more of a journey than it is normally presented as, was valuable for them. And I will pass it to Hannah.
Yeah, I think something to add to this idea of like intersecting military and homeless trajectories, particularly with that large gap, it makes me think this particularly of how do we think about our partnership models with our military partners. In the case of the Old Brewery mission, this isn't something we necessarily went into a huge amount of detail in the presentation, but it was a lot of work on our part, setting up partnerships with military organizations, organizations that serve veterans, that otherwise we had never really worked before, and realizing that not only is there that time gap, but there's a culture difference between the way homeless services work and how military organizations work. And so like, there's that thing of being like kind of caught up in the immediate experience of being homeless and then having to go way back to your military time. But working with those organizations, there's also a little bit of that work of being like, what happens in between exit from the military and this homeless, any homelessness experiences. That also gets caught up in this military culture versus homelessness culture, like when it comes to services. Like in our case, our strategy is to be very adaptable. We have to be fast moving. It's really meeting people where they're at. And often enough that comes up against like really heavy procedures, quite strict rules. Sometimes there's timeframes that have gone by that no longer apply to this person's programming case, but are still very important for us to liaise with. So I think there's that element too, that there's, with that time gap, there's also a recognition of how we have different homelessness service cultures and different military service cultures. Kate B, I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, so I'm sorry that I'm going to speak from the American experience down here in the States. So, but I don't know if this is what you all see in Canada, but what we see is that as folks leave the military, they're not what you would consider to be chronically homeless, right? They're couch surfing, they're staying with a friend, they're staying with family members. And then once there's a crisis, so maybe an older family member passes away, maybe as Dr. Maurer alluded to in the presentation, that there's a break in a relationship, that then starts the trajectory of the chronic homelessness. So again, like as people first exit, we see, at least in the US, that and policymakers have had to change definitions of homelessness to meet this need, that couch surfing counts. So that's really something that I think is important to note too, that there is a history of chronic instability in housing, and then there's a kind of a key point where it starts to become chronic.
That's great.
Sorry, jump in with one additional kind of link to all of this, is that the other thing that we brought to this that we think is unique in bringing the intersection of the homelessness with the military experience is that we did not focus on we didn't conduct the kind of research where people are focusing on social support and just counting people. We're talking about the quality and the nature of it, and it's shifting over time, which is sort of a third perspective in this. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you, everyone. That's wonderful. Well, I have another question for you. There are more rolling in. So in the presentation, it was mentioned that all of the subjects were men. Was this intentional? Do you think the results might be different if women were included? Was there any different findings for those that served in the military outside of Canada or that were of different ethnicities than white French Canadians, if that is the case? So that is the question. I don't know which one of you wants to start here.
Hannah, do you want to just talk about the program a little, maybe, and how that might have influenced?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was not purposeful for us to have an exclusively male sample. We would have loved a more gender diverse sample. I think that, so as far as it goes for the programming itself, we tend to only have men that access Les Sentinelles. And the reason for that, I think, is in part because of the services that we offer. So we do have a women's set of services, or we have several services that are specifically adapted to women at the Old Bury mission. That said, though, the point of contact for a lot of the counseling that's happening in Les Sentinelles, or when we were doing Opération Chez Toi, a lot of that was physically situated at our men's pavilion. So we definitely were scoping, we were looking for homeless veteran women, but as it turned out, the majority of the people who've accessed this resource have been men. And then when we went to go recruit, I believe at the time there was only men who were accessing the program. So that limited how we could really even diversify that, just limiting ourselves to that program. And I don't know, Kate, if you want to, or one of the Kates, if you guys want to speak to maybe how things would be different with the international participants.
Kate B, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So, it's interesting because as I do more qualitative research with veteran populations, I think, again, the military is in many ways a very gendered institution, right? And I think in particular, sort of stratifying women tend, at least in my work around experiences of institutional betrayal, female identified veterans tend to have a very different experience than male identified veterans. Just in terms of thematically, things are very different. And then if you add in non-binary gender identities, or folks who might identify, veterans who might identify as transgender, that's a completely different subset. So I think, yeah, it's interesting. And I wonder too if this study would have mimicked another study I'm working on, where we've interviewed both male and female veterans and have found such disparate findings, it's really become two separate studies. So I think that's interesting. As far as the international piece goes, yeah, I think that in thinking about sort of the qualitative experience of those participants, one is that I believe for both of them, and Hannah and Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, they were not volunteer militaries that these two veterans participated in. They were compulsory service as part of the nation that they were from. So that was very interesting. At the same time, themes that I've seen both in my clinical practice with veterans and that we saw in our interviews were very much the same, right? Like people felt both protected and betrayed by leadership. People felt that sort of the military had this ethos that was different. I will say, as I say that out loud, though, I think there is a little bit of a difference too, though, that when service is compulsory, sort of everyone shares in that. I don't want to call it a burden, but it's the only word I can think of. Everyone shares in that, right? Whereas for a lot of veterans, the process of coming out of the military, one of the biggest challenges is not being part of the team anymore and coming back to a really individualistic society. So I think maybe if we had, could follow up a little bit more on that, that's a theme that I think would really interest me more, right? Is how does that look different? That transition look different in terms of adjusting to more of a civilian dog eat dog world versus a place where service is compulsory for everyone.
Catherine, before Catherine, you join in, I just want to say from our perspective, that's quite consistent with things that we know at Veterans Affairs Canada. And in fact, a lot of veterans tell us they'll never consider themselves civilians. Like they'll always be somebody who served. And that's why we've moved away from that language. At least for us, we talk about the life after service instead of civilian life. So it's nice to hear that's a finding you have as well in the American context. Catherine, more?
I was just going to add, just thinking about what might have been different had we had some gender variation. I think we explained in the presentation that in the first interview, using the way that the secure base model is designed, the way the interview is designed, we asked, who do you ask for help? And the immediate response was, I don't ask for help, I'm the helper. And so I think it would be really interesting in the future, as we think about things we will follow up with, how that idea of what your role becomes outside of the military and of being that helper, that support person, what the gender differences, how that might represent, and what the capacity to conceptualize receiving help. So we moved it to, who do you talk to? Where do you, if there's difficulties arising in your life, who is implicated in that, rather than who do you ask for help from? And so, yeah, I think that would be a really interesting piece to pursue.
Wonderful, thanks. One question that has come up here, in the course of your research, did you ask the question, or were you able to find out whether any of the participants had reached out to Veterans Affairs Canada during their period of homelessness?
If I may, I'll jump in on this one. The question did come up. We were very purposeful about sort of categorizing the resources, You know, we had it where there was sort of the top level veteran resources, more community level veteran resources, homelessness resources, mental health resources. These were all very purposeful questions in the interviews. And some had reached out to Veteran Affairs. Some of them, it was very quickly after they had had their service, and others expressed that they never did. Some of them said that that was because either they felt like they didn't deserve it, or they felt like they wouldn't have qualified for it. So they just assumed that they were not those were not services that were made for them. I'm thinking particularly one person, I think, who was a reservist, just assumed that it wasn't going to be for them, so they just didn't reach out. And then once they realized that they did qualify for services years later, that was also really something that was difficult to kind of grapple with. Like they really had to think through what did it mean to actually be a veteran in a way that maybe that was an identifier they had never really resonated with. And that came through accessing those services, I think.
I was just going to say, you know, one, I think looking at there's some people who are doing this, of course, but like, I think looking at a comparative experience internationally of how Veterans Affairs or veterans agencies work throughout the world would be fascinating, because I was not expecting those findings as a US researcher in terms of hearing the same story in Canada that we hear in the States, because I'm sure folks in the audience know this, but in the US at least, VA is the largest single payer healthcare system in the US. We have a nationalized veterans hospital system, and it's very much tied to healthcare. So it was fascinating for me to see in Canada, where there is a national healthcare system, some of these same themes emerge that Hannah just talked about. And I just found that to be really, really interesting from my perspective.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And absolutely. I mean, we know we have some similarities between the two countries, as well as a number of differences. But, you know, thanks, Hannah and Catherine, for those comments. You know, and we know at Veterans Affairs outreach and getting that information out is really, really important. And it's why we do, you know, have quite a list of stakeholders and organizations across the country, and consistently trying to engage with and put, you know, our poster out there and contact information, just so that, you know, and people can call on behalf of veterans. So it is really, really important. And of course, we know too, and it is timely going into Veterans Week. We know that the image, or when people think of what is a veteran, changing that mindset from the traditional war service veterans to, you know, modern day veterans, the veterans of today. They're younger, it's a different cohort. So wanting all citizens to recognize that a veteran could be anybody. And it isn't maybe the traditional picture we've had in our head for, you know, for most of the rest of the last half of the 20th century. All right, the next question I have here is for Hannah. Hannah, this is a very interesting topic. Is this your thesis topic? It's fascinating. We hope we can read more about it in the future. And also, can you share how you arrived at this topic in the Department of Geography?
This is not my research in the geography department. That's a very funny question. I'm a researcher of many hats. So alas, no. I did put my McGill affiliation here, since I do receive funding from McGill, and do maintain a certain amount of presence within different departments. But no, my doctoral research is focused on barriers to services for people who use substances.
I will just jump in and say that the study was actually born from my clinical experience and my practice experience. So I've had immense pleasure of partnering with Hannah for, it seems to me like forever, in a good way. I cannot remember not being working with Hannah. Absolutely. If I could talk and do hearts at the same time, I would. It's been a fantastic collaboration, and Kate Bloser and I did our PhDs together in New York. And so we have a connection of clinical work. And so we brought her in to join with us because she has both the clinical practice experience in the VA in the United States. And then, I have my experience of working in homelessness. I worked in supportive housing in New York City. And then when I came up here, partnered with Old Brewery Mission, and I'm always interested in the quality and variability of relationships. And when we think about homelessness, we know that two of the biggest predictors of becoming homeless are one, what we just talked about, which is actually income, having money. And so the lack of connection with Veterans Affairs Canada, is very instrumental in, once the crisis happens, the becoming homeless, but secondarily, to really take a more, what we might call clinical perspective to social support. Rather than mapping networks, et cetera. And so we do hope to continue working in this research. And if we can keep Hannah with us, we will be very delighted for that.
Well, that's great to hear. What rings really true among you is the collaboration. And I know from working at this department and from working on the homelessness strategy, and I think everyone here in attendance knows that to address this issue, it's a team effort. There's no one person, there's no one organization, there's no one research project that will solve the issue. But it's nice to see people from different areas, even different disciplines, working all on the same issue. So that's really nice. And to pick up on that, Catherine, you just mentioned, one of the issues identified is sort of a lack of income. And one of the questions here is, understanding it's a small sample size, do you have any insights into how these homeless veterans would describe the solution to their homelessness? Is it as simple as permanent housing according to them? Curious about any qualitative insights.
I have a quick thought, but I'm certain everyone else does too. It's to, what I believe it was Kate M who was saying it earlier. This is also a study about measuring quality of services. And I think that is one thing that comes up if we're going to think about the solution to homelessness. It's not just about permanent housing, it's about quality, appropriate, really targeted permanent housing. And it goes back to this idea also of how important autonomy is to all of these participants. And so I think we really have a question to ask ourselves as service providers, as people offering these services. How much are we letting these veterans have agency in what we're letting them choose? We had participants who expressed that, yeah, it was great that they were in this apartment, but the end goal was for them to be somewhere else. And for some of them, that was, I want to own something. I want to have an apartment in my preferred neighborhood. I want to have an apartment where I can have my kids over. And this is not unique to veterans, I don't think, but I think it's particularly highlighted because there was that thing of a veteran never asks for help. And so what does ideal housing look like for most veterans? I think, like for a lot of people, it's a housing where I don't have to ask for help. It's just mine. I picked it. I take care of it. I'm sure the Kate M and Kate B have something to add to that.
I would just jump in and say, again, this is part of what, part of the impetus for this study, because so in New York City, I worked in a large organization that had, what we call in the States, Section 8 vouchers, so subsidies for moving people out into housing. And we had a huge pool of apartments. And we had a very hard time getting people to move out of the community in which they lived in supportive housing. So going back to this idea of how important relationships, community, connectivity is, because we often, when the policy is focused on housing first and just getting people into housing, As we saw, we spoke a bit, we didn't, have an opportunity to go fully in depth about how important the relationships that each of these men had with the service providers, so the particular people who were working with them in the Sentinel program, but also once they were connecting with some other veterans to start rebuilding new social networks. And we've really got to, from a policy perspective, stop, no, I'm not going to say that in a negative way, just enhance the way that we think about the communities where we're moving people. One of the things we saw in New York, that just is for me a really clear example of people saying, look, like, I don't want to take this apartment because when I walk into the grocery store, I don't even recognize the food. Like, all the names are different. It's not stuff I eat. The things that I'm looking for aren't there. And that community connection in conjunction with the family connections, and whether that's family chosen or family of origin, and to be really implicated in a neighborhood community environment is so important. And I think that that's just a huge piece. KP, do you want to add? We obviously refer to each other like this all the time. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I'll just note now, we have about 10 minutes left, and I've been told it's very important we end on time so that no one's late for the upcoming keynote. So I think we have time for just one or two more questions. So I'm going to go to the next one. Based on your research, so you talked about transition and how that can be a challenge, leaving the military to a life after service. Based on your research and your interactions with homeless veterans, do you have any insights to share around the transition out of the military or in homelessness prevention activities, acknowledging that the gap in time between a release and experiencing homelessness could be quite long?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to look at functional outcomes versus diagnostic. And I think it's really important to ask folks not to just do a post-traumatic stress disorder screen, right? To ask folks, how are things going in terms of your relationships? Would you say they're strained? How are things going in terms of your income, school? I think it's really important to focus on function rather than relying solely on diagnostic tools.
Yeah, what I was going to say, and I really appreciate how that question was asked, particularly as it brings up the idea of prevention, because I think, if we're talking about how could we make this transition period better, I think it's all about understanding what somebody's community, their family in the large sense of the word that they're exiting the military and entering into, and really asking ourselves the hard question of, like, what does it mean to strengthen that community before somebody exits the military? To have those conversations about what that community is going to look like, and managing expectations on both sides when somebody exits the military. And I think if we could effectively do that, that would be a huge preventative measure in homelessness.
And I would say, just to add to that, I think that often what's really challenging about transitions are when expectations and experience are mismatched. And so, that the focus, I think, needs to be on, what Kate was saying about more focus on the experiential part, and having those kind of conversations, and thinking about other areas in which I work where peer work is so important. And peer support in transitions could be really instrumental in in framing that, and just, this is fully conjecture, but I assume that some of the people who handle those, experience those transitions more smoothly, have more peer support and connection in that process.
That's great. Thank you. And I know, Catherine, to your point about peer support and peer transition, we know from our perspective that peer support, whether it be in homelessness or any other issue, whether it be post-traumatic stress disorder, an operational stress injury, or military sexual trauma, we know that peer support is a very effective tool. And I think it speaks to your research about the connections and the comrades in arms and keeping those connections. So thanks for that. We have time, and this question I think is a very quick one to answer. People would love to see your research. So where is your paper released, or when, and how can we get a copy?
I'll say real soon, and maybe we can put in the chat. So certainly the Old Brewery Mission, but also my lab. My lab is called the RAD Lab, which is Regulation, Affect, and Development, but it's RAADLAB at McGill.ca, and we will be posting slides, and then we are trying to get a paper out very quickly. Hannah and I have published one in a journal called Parity that's in Australia. And the link for that I think is on our website. So if you go and find me at McGill, I think I'm the only me there, and you should be able to find a link to the website. And yeah, we're very excited to get more of this out. Thank you so much. We are delighted to be here and have the chance to share our work at this conference that we have participated in and attended many times. So it's a real honor to be able to share this.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. So that, unfortunately, is all the time we have for questions. I want to make sure everyone has time for a quick break before Tanya Taglia's keynote speech. So with that, just on behalf of CAH and Veterans Affairs, I want to thank our presenters today and everyone in the audience. And I want to thank you for your dedication, for the collaboration you're demonstrating, and you know, for us and for the population that you're serving, like you're demonstrating care and compassion and respect, and those are the values of our organization, and that you know, how we want to support veterans, and you guys are living that through your research. So I really want to thank you for that. For everyone in attendance, I'd also like to share some information that if you are a part of an organization that serves veterans and you are working on innovative solutions to veteran homelessness in your community, please visit our website. There's a ton of information on how homeless or at-risk veterans can be supported, including on financial programs and services, as well as funding for organizations doing innovative research or projects. And that would be the Veteran and Family Wellbeing Fund. We're looking forward to announcing the latest successful projects very shortly. And we encourage anyone to reach out to us if you have questions on that. Another really important piece of information is if you are aware of a veteran or a former member of the RCMP who's experiencing homelessness or at risk of, please call our National Contact Center. The number for that is 1-866-522-2122, and you can be connected with a local office or with services and supports from Veterans Affairs that this person might be eligible for. Our conference organizers have asked me to remind you to complete the session evaluation located under the video player beside the discussion tab. Tanya Taglia's keynote will begin in about 15 minutes at 12:30 Eastern Time. So once again, thank you all and goodbye, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference here today.